Well, welcome, Jim, and also welcome everyone. It's so good to see this wonderful turnout and see everyone. This is one of the early studio visit. We're doing a summer series this summer, and for June, we're visiting a couple different studios. And this was spearheaded by a conversation with Penelope and Lyle. So thank you so much, Penelope, for organizing this and bringing us to these amazing places. And I can turn it over to you.
To me, okay.
Yeah, if you would just want to say.
Should I say a few words about, I actually thought Lyle might do it, and then at the last minute I realized that we haven't been in conversation, so I copied a bunch of things from your Werner bio. So I just gonna, like, you obviously need no introduction to any of us, but I'll just say a few things here. That you have had solo and group shows internationally. And in 1992, you were part of Documenta 9, and 2008, you were in the Whitney Biennial, or Jim was in the Whitney Biennial. Jim was a recipient of the Infinity Award, the ICP Infinity Award in 2014, has been published by Roman Numerals, Aperture, Pretzel, Steidel, Mac, and was the chair of the photography department at UCLA from 1995 to 2016. And since 2012, has been a professor at Princeton. So is there anything else that I should say here? Numerous awards and exhibitions, had a survey show that traveled nationally and internationally.
Oh, good. That's enough.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you, Penelope. And it's, you know, it's, at first I thought, I did a talk a couple of weeks ago at Mass Art, and I was really looking forward to going up to Boston and spending time there and seeing friends and then talking and visiting students. But in the end, you know, we did a Zoom talk, but I was able to talk from my dark room or work room or whatever you want to call it, because it's not really a dark room. So I realized there are some advantages to this new environment we're in. I can't see most of you, but I can feel your vibes. So, you know, I want to both get to what I'm doing now very quickly, but I also want to just run through some of the stuff that got me to where I am right now. I'm going to minimize all of your faces. So let's go to full screen view. And sorry about that.
And some disadvantages.
Yeah. So I use PDFs, and eventually they want to advance. So this is, I think, on a 60-second advance, I hope. But because I put it together from a couple of other PDFs, maybe it will, some of the slides will advance, and I'll have to just go back if I'm talking about them. This is a picture I took of John Baldessari's class in 1973 when I was a first-year grad student. We went out on a walk and took photographs, passed the camera around, and then I photographed John in the tall one, and Dee Dee Basic on the left, Suzanne Kuffler, Matt Mulliken, and Dave Trout. Being John's student at CalArts was very important. John died in January, so I've been thinking a lot about John. I wrote a couple of pieces about John. And one of the things that he encouraged his students to think about making art, both not to take it too seriously, to think of it as a game with certain rules, and to experiment. And there was nothing that was off limits. Turns out that John was a very accomplished photographer. He won prizes in high school for photography. So when I knew him, he was pretending like he didn't know how to use a camera. He was a total rube. So it was kind of interesting when I went back and read his catalog resume and saw that he was actually a very proficient photographer before he became an artist. John, of course, worked with photography, expanded its possibilities. When I was a student at CalArts, I was very interested in images from magazines. On the top are Winston and Marlboro ads that I was collecting. I'm pinning stuff up on my studio wall. So my thesis show at CalArts consisted of juxtapositions of images. Well, here's a view of my studio floor with some cigarette ads and some other photographs and scissors, box of Agfa Brovera paper on the right, even though I really wasn't doing much of my own printing. So I made a couple of, maybe you could call them ironic, photographs of different famous artists. This is, of course, Mark Rothko and Alberto Giacometti, both smoking. This was in my thesis show. And then this picture, Jackson Pollock and Richard Serra. Recently, I tried to get the rights to the Pollock picture. The Serra picture I already was able to get the rights to as for a print for CalArts to kind of benefit the 50th anniversary of the founding of CalArts, but we just could not get the rights to the Pollock. So it exists as a collage, but I guess it won't be, nothing else will happen with it. A little upsetting that the Krasner Pollock estate wouldn't give me rights to use this to benefit CalArts. When I was 25, I graduated from CalArts the year before. I was really at a loss as to what to do. I didn't want to just cut pictures out of magazines. So I borrowed a friend's darkroom and made some photograms of my hands. A couple of months later, I used those photograms to make these pictures, positive photograms. And without really thinking too much about it, I saw that I could use these resin-coated black and white prints as paper negatives. And so I inverted these pictures. And it turned out that I have subsequently done other photograms and I really like flipping them around, so they're positives. As I said, I made these when I was 25. I then really committed to photography. I wasn't sure when I graduated from CalArts what kind of work I would do: video, performance, installation, photo pieces, but I decided I really wanted to be a photographer. So I bought a 4x5 camera, taught myself how to process film, and went around mostly at night in Santa Monica, California, where I was living, and photographed at night, but also by day, biking around with a 4x5 on the back of my bicycle. I learned that you had a choice in when you printed black and white. You could choose different sorts of papers. So I chose a very bluish photographic paper, and these prints, actually they're 4x5 inches, made on a no longer manufactured paper called Azo, which was very slow and very blue. This is one of my friends, Jack Goldstein, who was a student at CalArts and who I was very close to. So this project includes portraits and photographs of architecture. So I called it Los Angeles Architecture and Portraits. The filmmaker Erica Beckman. I was just really struggling with photography. Making contact prints saved my negatives, which were sometimes so dense that you could look at an eclipse through them. I was terrible technically, but somehow or other I was able to make prints of these negatives. So I'm not doing a chronological talk. I'm starting out with some early work, but then 20 years after I made that picture of the Exbrook Arms in Santa Monica, I began a project really without really understanding what I was doing. I began to photograph light bulbs. This is in 1995, 1994. I was traveling, showing in Europe. So this is a picture I took in a friend's apartment in France. This is an elevator in Belgium. So I began to make photographs of light. I called them light sources. I'm having a running argument with my friend and colleague down at Princeton, Jeff Whetstone. Whenever I see a picture with the sun in it, I say that's a great photograph, and Jeff says that's a total no-no. You never want to do that. Well, I guess I'm on the no-no side here. So these pictures begun in when I lived in New York in 1995. I went out to Los Angeles to work to take over the photo program that Robert Heineken had started. And these are my first digital prints. I used film, but I scanned the film and made what were then known as iris prints. I also mined my photo archive. This is a picture of Jack Goldstein, same period as the earlier LA architecture. So I incorporated some of the pictures that I'd made in LA in this series Light Sources. And I also used some of my appropriated images from that period also. Wolfgang Tillmans, I was both inspired by, I think, mutual admiration for each other. And at one point, Tillmans was asked by a magazine if they could photograph him. He said, yes, but only if Jim Welling does it. Wolfgang didn't know about my portrait work, so he thought I would never consent to take a portrait, but I did. So this is Wolfgang. Different sized prints, mostly big, but this is a small one. So with light sources, again, I photographed almost anything I could think of, because it turns out it's a truism that everything we see with our eyes is because of emitted or transmitted or reflected light. So everything is a light source. And then arcing way back, right after the LA architecture and portraits pictures, I visited my parents in Connecticut. I grew up in northern Connecticut, and I began to photograph there. So it's a group of pictures of a 19th century book with landscape pictures. It was called Diary and Landscape. The diary was written by my father's great-grandmother in the 1840s. And I was really struck by the quality of the handwriting and the physical properties of the paper. Also, it was, 100 years, this was around the dawn of photography, 1840. So I thought it was kind of appropriate to start your career. These were some of the first pictures after the LA architecture ones that I was referencing the early history of photography. And then other pictures, my mom's plants. A plant from 1840. Then I'll show a few other, I think this is the only other documentary project I'll show you. I photographed, right before light sources, I photographed railroads. Sort of all my early work was in black and white. Color wasn't an option, but I found that these railroad landscapes were just fantastic in black and white. Is everyone still there, Penelope?
Yes, yep, we're all here.
Okay.
I assume we're all here.
Yeah, well, usually, there's some rustling.
I'm on mute so that you don't hear me clicking away
Oh,
because
oh,
I've
yeah.
taken a few notes. So.
Oh, no problem. No problem. Good. Okay. So this picture, which is pretty obscure, this is actually a silver factory in central Connecticut. And, you know, I began to think a little bit more about what photography was, silver and gelatin. And so this is a very obscure picture of a silver factory, and also some train tracks on the left. As I get older, I think more about these elemental components of photography, the silver part, the gelatin part. But here I was just interested in the sort of both evocative and haunting kind of subject matter around railroads, but also it's also a very mundane way to get around. The subway, I go to Princeton by train. I also photographed houses. These are in West Virginia. I was really struck by these wood frame houses, which I quite love. Of course, you know, you can't make a picture like this without referencing Walker Evans, who, of course, was a great early influence of mine, as was Moholy-Nagy, Paul Strand, Barbara Morgan. Charles Birchfield, Edward Hopper, all of that Americana I was steeped in when I was in high school. And so 15 years out of high school, I was able to go back to the subject matter that really interested me when I was an adolescent, which was a kind of brooding American vernacular architecture. And this picture, when I show it, I've shown it a couple of times in survey shows. I always like to have this picture next to this picture. So this is a picture from 1995, 94, a bridge in Cumberland, Maryland. And then this is a photogram made in 1998. I was still making railroads, but I began this sort of way that I work now, which is working on an abstract project, but also on more documentary things. So this is these are small strips of paper that I laid down on 8x10 film and made photograms, and then inverted them, scanned them, and then flipped them around in the computer, and then made digital negatives and printed them as darkroom prints. So it's a kind of mix of digital and analog. With architectural associations, I also was thinking of, you know, certain avant-garde scores where you have bars, John Cage or Earl Brown would just have lines. Thought of them in terms of music. And then a very early project, I photographed aluminum foil following the LA architecture, and I was printing on that same strange blue paper, azo. These are very small prints, 2x3 inches or 4x5. One of the things that I discovered with this group of work, which I made 15 years after the aluminum foil pictures, I think it's true of abstract art in general and abstract photography, is that you enter this sort of headspace when you look at an abstract work. And I've always felt with these, I call them new abstractions, I could enter them for a few seconds, and then the space was so cold or hard to get into that I would have to jump out. And with the aluminum foil pictures too, it was you could get lost in these folds, like looking at a field of wheat or something, a tree, and then you exit. And you know, that's not true of all photographs. Many photographs you can enter and never leave, but with these abstract pictures, they're I don't know if forbidding is the right word, but you don't want to stay on them too long, but you also are attracted by them. This is an installation view at the first Metro Picture Space, where I showed them in 1981. This is my studio setup. I had a single light bulb, and you can see the aluminum foil on the right. Following the aluminum foil, I made these pictures with a piece of actually orange velvet, drapery velvet, and pastry dough. For about 5 years, I worked in restaurants to support myself, and the aluminum foil came from the restaurant, and this pastry dough also I used to make like shepherd's pie. I always thought that there was a relationship between photography and cooking. You know, you wear an apron, you've got these different procedures, lots of water. And then this project, which I did in 1984, where I photographed chunks of gelatin. I was really struck by the component that photographs are made of gelatin and silver. I showed you that silver factory, and this was my sort of bookend to what photography was. It was gelatin, which is, as we all know, animal and vegetable material that's been boiled down, and it's a very interesting material property that I'll get to in a little bit later with some other work, also made with gelatin. Then jumping ahead to the last group of abstract pictures I'll show you. These are some recent chemograms where I've painted with fixer or developer, and then developed and fixed pieces of paper. So I'm using the materials out of sequence. The white forms were fixer, and then of course the black is developer. These are all done in room light. And I started these about 2013, and it really got me thinking about how to work in photography but not have a dark room. So these are done in room light, and you'll see some of the other processes that I'm working on. I don't have to turn the lights off. These are pretty small, most of them, 8 by 10 or 11 by 14, although I have made bigger ones. The small ones seem to have an energy that it's hard to reproduce larger. This picture, I used olive oil, put olive oil all over the paper, and then poured developer on the paper. And I don't know if any of you have made chemograms where you paint with photochemistry on black and white or chromogenic paper. Mariah Robertson makes chemograms. A lot of people, if you go online, there's lots of ways to work with chemograms. Scratching, drawing. So the work I've been doing for the last 15 or so years has really been largely focused on color. And you know, ever since I've been interested in photography, I've thought about color. I made Polaroid pictures when I was just starting out. I didn't make a lot of C prints until I got to UCLA. And then at UCLA, I installed a chromogenic printer, RA4 processor. And so the UCLA curriculum was chromogenic printing. I put black and white on the back burner because a lot of the students at UCLA were not art majors, were not photo majors, they were painters or sculptors. And so they just wanted to make some photographs or do photo pieces. So coming out of my working with Baldessari, I didn't think it was necessary to, you know, teach students how to make black, you know, small black and white prints and then graduate to color. Right away, we went to color. So I was thinking a lot about color. About 10 years into the 20 years I was in Los Angeles, I tried to think about how to deal with the fact that color, we see it with red, green, and blue receptors. You have red, green, and blue layers of dyes, cyan, magenta, yellow dyes, red, green, and blue sensitivity. trichromatic vision or trichromatic processes. Turns out that all color is mediated by trichromatic processes, except one, which is too complicated and too impractical, the Lippmann process, which is a direct color process, which doesn't use trichromatic methods. So everything is done trichromatically: the brain, the eye, the camera, reproduction, all red, green, and blue, or cyan, magenta, yellow. So in this picture, which is called a hexachrome, I set up my 4x5 in front of this succulent. It was a windy day, so the shadows were moving all over the shadows of the trees outside the frame were moving all over these succulents. And over the course of about 5 minutes, I made 6 exposures on the film: red, green, and blue filters, then cyan, magenta, and yellow filters. So wherever the sun was hitting the succulent at that moment, it would record that filtration. So as the shadows whipped around, you can see that different filters are being revealed: red filter, blue filter, yellow, magenta, cyan. So I work, I don't know if intuitively is the right word, but I had this group of filters that I was experimenting with. And I was invited by New York Magazine to photograph the Philip Johnson Glass House in 2006. It was opening up to the public. It was a National Trust for Historic Preservation site. And so I took my filters and went there with a early digital camera and put my filters in front of the lens and began to photograph the glass house using colored filters. Actually, as soon as I say that, this is the only picture, one of the few pictures that doesn't involve a pure filtration. I took the bottom of the picture and turned it into a grayscale image in Photoshop. But in general, these pictures are all made with frosted plexiglass, clear acetate filters, very little Photoshop manipulation. I crumpled up a piece of Mylar and put it in front of the lens. I had something called a diffraction grating, which breaks light up into a spectrum. I rotated the filters as I took a 1-second exposure. So this, I went to the glass house 12 times. I made videos. I took a lot of photographs, and it became a laboratory for experimenting with both color filtration and then how to print these. So these were my first inkjet prints. To print them, I bought an Epson printer, and that really changed my life. I think that inkjet printing, as opposed to, say, C printing, inkjet is a totally different medium. The ink is thick. It doesn't have the transparency. It still has some brightness to it, but it's just to me, it seems like a very different medium. Ink versus dyes. Pigments versus dyes. So I learned a lot about inkjet printing in the glass house, a project I worked on for 4 years. Then I had the opportunity to print a book at Meridian Printing in Rhode Island. And I went there and spent 2 days at Meridian watching the book being printed, but I also wandered around the factory and photographed this project, which I call Meridian Printing. I took the files after I came back home and altered them by intensifying the red, yellow, blue primaries in hue and saturation, and then desaturated all the grays, and then futzed around with them. So there's a lot of desaturation and resaturation. This was printed as a small book by Roman numerals by Meridian. They were very happy to print this. My father worked for a printing company, so I've always been interested in mechanical reproduction. And this, being at Meridian, thinking about the process of 4-color offset, thinking about trichromatic color has pushed me into this whole new project, experimental or endeavor, where thinking about how images are put together. So this is an example of a sheet at the top of this pile of printed material. This is called a make-ready. It's a piece of paper that's run through the printing press multiple times to get the press up to speed. So every time a new signature is put on the press, you need to run 50 or 100 sheets of paper through the press to get the ink even. And then the thrifty printer will save that sheet and they'll use them a second time. So you get these very strange juxtapositions of images. And I became interested in make-readies. So I began to create my own make-readies, scanning different books, typography books, catalogs, flat material, and then stacking them up in red, green, and blue channels of Photoshop. So you get these strange juxtapositions and overlays. I think it's interesting that the make ready, which is the name for this, my father called it usable scrap, but make ready is what most people call these objects, is an inversion of the ready-made. Duchamp's famous use of found objects. I discovered also in the glass house, and then as I began to work with these more bizarre color combinations, that these colors, which seem very abnormal, I would see them in graphic design, I'd see them in signage, I'd see them in the world. So this is one of the earliest photographs from a body of work that I call multi-channel, where I'm taking 3 photographs, this time a Tony Smith sculpture and two images of the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford, and stacking them up in red, green, and blue channels, and then using hue and saturation, selective color, gradient maps to further alter the color. The Wadsworth invited me to do a project about their collection or their building because they were remodeling and reopening the whole museum in 2014. So this is an image that I made of the Morgan Hall, taken in 1925 with 2 of my own photographs. So it mixes an archival picture with 2 of my own images. I also did a project for the Museum of Modern Art Sculpture Garden, and photographed other objects. One of the things that I decided I wanted to work on was dance. And I wanted to use these multi-channel techniques. So in 2014, I got together some UCLA art students who were studying dance. And for 4 Saturdays, I had them pose based on historic dance photographs. One of my most important early art school experiences was taking dance classes. And for a year and a half, I was very interested in dance. And when I transferred to Cal Arts, I dropped dance because I needed to focus on making visual art. But I never lost my love of or interest in modern dance. So these are pictures that I asked my UCLA students to reenact. You can see the upper left, and the two pictures on the left are, let's see if I can go back. This one is one of them. Maybe they're both reenacting this picture. So I began to photograph the UCLA students. I also worked with Barnard College and Manhattan Marymount students. And I wasn't satisfied with just working with the dance pictures, so I began to incorporate architecture into the 3 channels. And it turned out that I was in Florida visiting my mother-in-law, and I photographed a remarkable building by Marcel Breuer. You can kind of see it on the left-hand side of this picture. And then, so this project uses generally one picture of a brutalist building by either Breuer or other architects with 2 dance pictures. So this is one of my students, and then a very dim picture on the lower right. You can see it's kind of greenish to compose the 3rd channel. Here's another Marcel Breuer building with a Renaissance dance by the New York City ballet dancer David Halberg. Terry O'Connor with some buildings in Hartford and some landscape. This is a picture I took on the West Side Highway of Barnard College and Manhattan Marymount dance students. You can see on the left, that's me photographing. When I was able to work with an assistant with the students, I would, both of us would photograph, because it was, I was never sure I was getting the right angle. So I generally tried to have a grad student assistant. And so JR, my assistant that day, photographed me photographing the same group of dancers at the same instant. So you can see, I can see certain of the dancers are repeated. With the glass house, a lot of the pictures were straight. These are heavily worked on, lots of painting through layers. Layers are dissolving. I began to work with a dance company in Los Angeles, LA Dance Project. So there, about half of the pictures are LA Dance Project. And then, as I worked this way, I became interested in antecedents, precedents to this kind of psychedelic photography that I was creating. And on the left, this is a page. I didn't have time to grab the full picture, but this is just a layout from a catalog that is coming out of the choreographed pictures. On the left is a double-page spread of a Richard Avedon ad campaign called Moondrops for Revlon. And I went to the Avedon studio to find out where I could locate these, and they gave me a whole list of all of the issues of Vogue where Avedon's pictures appeared. So I don't know if you can see, but it's a color photograph with certain elements are replaced with very vibrant colors. As I looked at the Avedon, I also remembered that there was a whole group of artists in the 1970s who worked with this, what I call multi-channel color, where they weren't satisfied with what color negatives gave them, and they began to work on offset presses, typically, or with silkscreen. So the next 3 pictures are from a small catalog called 4 on the Offset Press, published by the Visual Studies Workshop in Rochester. So this is Joan Lyons. Sil Labrot, who worked with silk screen and dye transfer, and Todd Walker. So what these artists are doing is, working with the channels. I'm not saying this work is necessarily the greatest work, but it was a kind of breath of fresh air from the Walker Evans school of new topographics or new color, or all of the kind of more mainstream, straight ahead photographic processes that proliferated in the 70s and 80s and 90s when type C printing really came of age. These artists from the 70s, working up in Rochester primarily, were really hampered by the fact that there was no simple way to make these color photographs. You had to get an offset press or a silk screen. Although that's not exactly true. In my teaching at Princeton, I teach a class called Pathological Color, and I was scrolling around on the internet and I found this book from the 70s, maybe early 80s, that Kodak published, and it was a how-to guide to make these multi-channel photographs using a color processor, using black and white film, sandwiching it, multiple exposures, things like that. So there was a way to make multi-channel color, but it was still very, very difficult before digital and inkjet printing. So while I was working on Choreograph, I was invited to take some photographs for the Chicago Architecture Biennial in 2017, and I photographed buildings by Mies van der Rohe in Chicago. But it turned out that I visited Chicago in 1986, 1996, and 2006, and photographed the same buildings by Mies. This is Crown Hall. And so I combined those 20 years of negatives together to make this picture. This is the post office in Chicago, more like the Moondrops, where I substituted certain colors. Back to using recycling images from 20 years. The Moondrops technique, which basically involves taking two color files, duplicating the same file and sticking a gradient map in between them. And back to the dance, LA Dance Project. What was really surprising was LA Dance Project and actually the dancers of LA Dance Project and the choreographers Kelly and Gerard, who were New York based, now they're living in France. They did a piece at the Glass House. So I was able to go back to the Glass House a few years after I finished my project and photograph at the Glass House a second time, but using these new techniques that I'd created. And then other choreographed photographs. Lucinda Childs, Available Light, LA Dance Project, a rehearsal. Kyle Abraham, another Kelly and Gerard work. So I began to get tired of making all these appointments to photograph dance, getting the dancers to sign releases. So anyway, it was the Choreograph project, after about 4 years, came to a sort of graceful end. It's now pretty much completed, and a show in Rochester will open next month, I hope. probably really realistically in September. But I wanted to keep working with bodies. And so I began to go to museums, starting in 2016, when I was actually working on choreograph. I started photographing Greek and Roman sculpture. And so this last group of photographs I'll show you is up as a digital show at Regan Projects of, so I'm going to show you how I make these pictures. This is it's an oil on a laser print. But before I get there, I'll show you this. The day I went to the Met, I photographed that sculpture that I just showed you, and I photographed this head. I photographed a lot of heads. I wanted to do Roman portraits. And I kept scanning or printing, and this head just kept speaking to me. Turns out this was a woman born in 170 AD, died in 230 AD. She was the mother of an emperor. She was effectively the Roman emperor for 10 years while her son came of age. Her name is Julia Mamaea. But her face is badly disfigured. Half of it's been hammered away. Her nose, which is very common, has been smashed. That was a sign of, disapproval or disrespect. Or, I mean, it didn't start with the Romans. It started in other parts of the antique world. But this sculpture, those eyes were very compelling. So I began to, this is the same sculpture. It's the same file. I zoomed in on the head. I flipped the head around, and I created a new process. Ever since I'd begun working on choreograph, I wanted to try to figure out a way to make a handmade color photograph. And my attempts were always failures. This process, which I developed, comes out of a 19th century printing process, basically photolithography, using gelatin and potassium dichromate. Instead of using oil paint or lithography ink, I used dye. So I created a digital negative. And then exposed it to the sensitized gelatin surface on a piece of plastic, washed away anything that wasn't hardened, and used dye to create the image. All of these pictures you're going to see are made from exactly the same negative. So these first three, are all made within a few days of each other. I was really struggling with the process, using different dyes, different inks. Not sure of what would work, but what was absolutely astonishing to me was that every time I printed the face, she seemed to address me in a different way. Her gaze changed, her hair's changed. She looked like a Roman woman occasionally, sometimes, or she would look like someone from the 1920s. Absolutely surprising and amazing to print the same negative over and over, and it would change. So Michael Mack is going to do a book of these, of about 100 of them. I learned that all color photographs are made with dyes. I think everyone knows that, but what was really surprising was that these are fabric dyes, and that there's a connection to the ancient art of fabric dyeing and photography. Still haven't quite figured out how to do anything with that, but I was really surprised. This is using India ink, which sticks to different parts of the gelatin matrix. And then I printed the negative, the actual way she's looking. And again, this face changes from one of horrific violence to serene contemplation. I began to think about what this meant, what this horrific face represented, and I discovered or finally realized that it represents religious intolerance. These sculptures were damaged by probably Christian zealots who were interested in overturning the pagan world. Julia was alive at a time when Christianity was rising in Rome. She was actually friends with a number of the Christian leaders, but she came from a family of priests from Syria. She was Syrian, and her family were sun god priests. She was born in Homs, Syria. Anyway, I began to read more about antiquity, and I realized I wanted to, besides just photograph busts, I wanted to think more about the ancient world and do something with it. After 3 months of making these pictures, I realized that potassium dichromate is a carcinogen, and I didn't want to work this way anymore. So I began to research non-toxic ways to work with imagery, and I came up with another process. This is a, basically it's a photolithograph. Using a Hewlett-Packard laser printer, I image a color image or a black and white image onto a piece of plastic, and then use oil paint to color the image. The first ones I made were in black and white, and what's striking about these pictures is that the quality of the black is very beautiful. It's very matte, almost oily at times. And you can see that the background, the white of the paper or the plastic is kind of creamy. So I started these almost a year ago. I went to Athens. I photographed a lot in Athens and in Eleusis. This is an acanthus plant in Athens. The Roman Agora, the marketplace down the hill from the Acropolis. Part of the Acropolis. Part of the Parthenon, sorry. This is a view from the Acropolis. So these are oil paint on laser print. And when I finish the talk, I'll demonstrate one. It's hard to see. This picture has a lot of water streaming down it, and that I then captured. This is at the Met. It's a bronze crab. I became very interested in little figurines and other sorts of objects. This is a pomegranate, terracotta pomegranate. I also became interested in Roman sculptures and in gesture. So I have a group of pictures of hands. Wreaths. These are all from probably 5th to 3rd century BC, the objects I've been showing you. This is a makeup container. At the site, the archaeological site of Eleusis. Archaeological Museum in Athens. Athens. the Erechtheion, head of a priest, fig leaves. And then finally, I'll show you some, these are different process. They're not lithographs, they're UV prints, which is a new technology where you can print directly on any surface really. So these are printed directly on metal. And the Propylaea on the Acropolis. And I used an app to figure out what stars would be in the sky the day I created this photograph. So those are accurate stars looking to the southwest. This is an angel in the Louvre. I mean, a Greek angel, pre-Christian. And finally, this photograph, which I'll end with, it's a picture of Socrates, but it's my homage to John Baldessari, because it reminds me quite a bit of John. So, that is my recorded talk. And let's see. Okay, I've left screen share and you can see me. So let me just turn this a little bit over here and I'll show you my darkroom sink. So this is, hang on a second. I don't want to get oil paint on my shirt. So I have a tray of water here. I have a laser print on Pronto plate. This is black and white. Any of you have made a photolithograph, you would know what these procedures are. So you soak the plate. I'm going to use blue and black oil paint. I use Winsor and Newton. I'm going to use Prussian blue and Mars black. Mix it up. What I like about this process is I can create any color I want, any black. I can do a warm black, cool black. So over here I have the plate, and before I squeegee it, I'm going to remove some of the ink from the roller. And then I take my sprayer. I roll it across the plate and I get a lot of imperfections. Like, but for a demonstration, I'm going to try to create a clean print. And I'm going to wash it. And there we have it, a oil on laser print image. Now, if I wanted to print this in color, I would just use my laser printer, print a color image, and then add, sometimes I'll subtract cyan, and I'll add cyan in ink, or I'll print a very oversaturated image and roll it out with black ink. Anyway, it's a very interesting way. Wait, sorry, go on.
Well, I was just wondering, so the ink, the printing ink sticks to the laser ink. Is that what that is, or was that actually etched?
It turns out that laser prints use carbon particles, and they print with an 800 line screen. So any laser print has a halftone screen, and that's what permits the oil paint to stick to create a photographic image, is the halftone. I'm just going to put this in a little frame. Yeah, so the ink sticks to the carbon. It is repelled by the wet areas of these pre-cut mats, so I can see the image a little bit better. And it's a bluish black photograph. We're getting some stripes from the printer, which are unfortunate. I'll have to deal with that later. Okay, so that's that process. But I also wanted to show you this picture, these Julia Mimea heads. So I made about 200 of these. So this is it's on a piece of plastic called UPO. On the back, you can see all the different colors. It's really a gum bichromate print using a halftone screen. It's completely matte at this point, but at one point it was, soaked in dyes, and the dye stuck to different parts of the image. Anyway, but I love the back of them, because you can see these, all of the, it's like you work in the idea of making a color photograph where you have trays of color is quite exciting. Don't try this at home. Okay, so that's my little
nice
demo part.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah.
I say something that one of the most, I guess, one of my first kind of realizations around photography, or sort of realization of something cool about photography, was through reading a piece by Walter Ben Michaels about your aluminum work, where he talks about and also the handwriting. He talks about the difference between or the tension between the surface of the photograph and the photographed surface. And I think there's a really interesting through line between that work that's so early and this work now, where in fact, looking through some of the slides that you're showing us, there's this really great tension between some of the surfaces that are a tension between the surfaces and the photographic surface that you're presenting to us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, that was I was very excited to meet someone who was able to talk about that sort of tension between what is being photographed and the way it's being presented. So the idea of the photographic surface is obviously something that's very important, but as a young photographer, I didn't I just bought different, I would buy different surfaces. You buy different photo paper, you buy different things. So as I've gotten older, I've tried to think about actually creating my own photographic surface. And it turns out it's really hard. So these two new processes I'm working on, it's sort of just an attempt to have some control over the surface. UV printing also, which is you can print on any material. It's very exciting. Anyway, yeah. Photo surface.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's really great. Anybody else have? Because I have like 10 questions.
I would like to ask, like, I saw like your interest in different like objects and researching like mundane objects, also Bob lights, light sources, and I'm wondering, like, if the color for you it's only related with the photography object, or also the color of the objects are an interesting part for your practice or for your work.
Yes, definitely. I don't want to only impose my own color onto things. I mean, I've been doing that for a while. But with these laser prints, I'm both working very psychedelic imagery, but I'm also doing more naturalistic color. I don't know if I can. Over here, I've got some pictures from Parthenon and different museums where I'm really, they're very naturalistic. I don't know if that helps with your question. I can see that you like bright colors. You've got some filters over your window.
Yeah.
Where are you located?
I am in Manhattan.
Oh, you're in Manhattan, yeah. I thought I recognized Manhattan out those windows.
No, I just like put them this morning to block some light.
Yeah.
Very, very rose colored there. Are these prints? They're all unique, right? Then, or you don't then make a negative, like another photograph that you can then edition, right?
I do make them in editions, quote unquote, but the black and white ones are easier to repeat them, but the color ones, each one will be different, but they're not unique in that I'm printing from the same matrix, but when I roll the ink on, it's going to be different.
Can I ask you a question that's not related to this body of work, but that's
Yes.
related to the glass house? And
Yes.
it's actually more of a question for the students to hear your answer to, because I found it really fascinating that began as an assignment, basically, or a commission, and then it lasted for 4 years. So obviously it went past the assignment period. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how assignments actually feed into maybe expanding work, or giving opportunities for producing or creating or making or whatever, that feed into your work and actually expand it somehow, or yeah.
I have not done a lot of commercial work. I have a lot of respect for people who can produce pictures on the spot. It's always always anxiety producing to have to do something with a photo editor looking over your shoulder. But with the glass house, I'd actually been turned down by an architecture magazine. I remember I proposed that I photograph the glass house using filters, and they said, no way. So then I wrote to New York Magazine and said I was just rejected by, I forget which magazine. Maybe you'd like to let me photograph the glass house this way. And fortunately, the editor, Jody Kwan, was very sympathetic to a different approach. And so I was able to do that. But I think I've done 2 projects for the New York Times. I used to work for Los Angeles Magazine a long time ago. I did like 3 photographs. My assignment work is very, very limited. But one of the great things about working on assignment is that the magazine gets you all of the permissions you need. So it is a wonderful way to just enter a situation without having to have written all these letters and, you know, jump through all these hoops. So I would encourage you, whenever possible, to consider magazine work or editorial as a great opportunity to get access to places that you might not be able to otherwise get access to. And but I just when I worked for Sotheby's, and I also worked as a photo assistant, and I was not good at either. So I had a lot of.
Actually, I'm surprised. I actually thought, by the way you introduced that project, that the magazine had approached you, knowing your style, to do this project.
Well, I think
the other way around. Yeah.
But I let them know right away that I didn't, and that coincided with what they wanted to do too.
Yeah.
So I was lucky.
I have a question
for commercial work. I just don't. Yes.
Oh yeah. I really enjoyed you talking about meridian printing in Rhode Island and that process of finding a printer. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about why you chose them and that process for you, and any advice that you have for students who are thinking about printing their work in a book form, but also for students who are really when the printing process or the alternative process of making the photograph is important in their work, how to guide them into like printing a book of that, in a sense.
Right. Well, I worked with this. Meridian is a very expensive printer. I would not recommend that you even think about using them. I used their Indigo press. The thing about printing books is that everyone has the same technology, and there's no mystery about how good printing takes place. It's that the people who are running the presses are careful, and that you give them the right files. So I've had very good luck doing blurb books for myself, and I think I'm sure all of you have done on-demand books. There's nothing, there's no mystery to it. You just have to have good files and a printer who is paying attention. I've also had books that were horribly printed. I've had 2 books that were just, I wanted to throw them in the river on different occasions. So if you get things printed, you will have disappointments as well as successes. So just be prepared. I had a student in LA who did wonderful things on a laser printer. He had optimized his laser printer, and he would print on newsprint and made beautiful little books. So you can make great stuff with a laser printer too. Just have to understand what each technology is good for.
I have another question on the subject of books also. I saw your Julia show at Zorner. I think it was like must have been January.
Yes.
I'm a huge fan of Mack and what Michael Mack does with all of his books. And I was curious how you translated such a huge show into a book, and how do books really function for you after having an exhibition of the work first? Well,
That show, I think I exhibited 20 of the Julia heads. I was very unhappy with it. I've subsequently shown them more bunched together, so they're in a grid, so you can see all of the different expressions. So the show was a disappointment. I mean, I love the work, but I don't think it was displayed as well as it could have been. The book, I think, is going to be the most appropriate form for this work, because there's something called facing pages, where you have, the whole idea of the book, the portrait format, everything about that is about, the face. So I'm excited about doing that. Michael has, because of COVID-19, we put it on hold. I don't know if it's going to happen. It turns out that these prints are very hard to color correct. You scan them, the scanner wants to do all kinds of, the software wants to make them more vibrant. So I've had to go through a number of steps to kind of tone them down. And still, I sent match prints that I made on my Epson printer and then files to Michael Mack. I don't know if we're going to be able to reproduce the work exactly as it is. I'm actually okay with them being a little bit different, just as long as they look okay. I mean, I think with printing, there's always it's never going to be exactly the same as your photograph. Sometimes it's going to be a lot better. So it's, I'm very hopeful that Michael will be able to get this back on the schedule and we'll get it printed. It'll be printed somewhere. I'm not going to go on press. I find going on press very nerve-wracking because you go there and they say, do you like it? When it comes off the printing press, and they say, but it's going to dry darker. Just imagine it's going to dry darker. Do you like it? It's extremely stressful. So,
just one other thing on that is, considering how much repetition there is in the actual subject matter itself, do you have much of a hand in how you would sequence it? Or, I mean, is it like something like, you do them chronologically because that's how you actually made them? Or
I made an edit, then my wife took the material, she made an edit, we fought over it. Then I decided the easiest way to do it is just numerically, the first picture to the last picture. But of course, there are a couple of juxtapositions that just didn't work. So I had to change that a little bit. But if I decided to edit the book, not numerically, it just would have gone on forever because there are all of these pictures that could look good next to each other. So I decided to do it sequentially. I don't do that with all my books. So good question, thank you.
Thank you.
It's interesting that, when you showed us the demo with that laser print and there were those lines in it, and you said you had to fix that. And also this idea of bringing the work through this other process, which is the printing, the offset printing or whatever, that I'm curious about that as being yet another kind of, mediating device that you could really work with and play through. Like you said, that you're okay with a bit of a change, but you still want the images to look. But yeah, it's something I think a lot about with presses. Like, yeah, they're supposed to be exactly right and really technically exact. But what happens when they're not? And yeah.
Well, I'm going to have to use toothpaste and a Q-tip on this, on the marks that the printer left, or I'll just reprint it.
Yeah.
All kinds of correction, tools. But the whole idea of the medium, quote unquote, photography is a medium. One of the things that I like to tell students and think about is that every artist creates their own medium. And in photography, it's maybe easier to understand that, of course, you want to be in control of all of the different aspects of, aperture, shutter speed, file management, printing. But then, my understanding of Photoshop is very primitive, and I am not a whiz. And in fact, you look at historically photographers, and it's shocking how little some of them know, but they're able to make that work for them. So it's important to try to get as much knowledge as you can, the things that you don't want, and you just concentrate on maybe a more primitive or simple way of working.
Mm-hmm. There's something interesting about this, the idea of fidelity and reproduction, even with the content that you're working with, which is this head that you're reproducing multiple times. And in fact, the original sculpture that you photographed, I would imagine, was also reproduction.
Interesting. Yes, it turns out that the imperial sculptures were created en masse, and I've seen some other really bad sculptures of Julia Mamaea. So she was a public figure, and there was no mechanical reproduction. This was a kind of mechanical reproduction.
Right, right.
So her head, there are apparently 20 versions of her head. I've seen 2, and they're just awful. Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
And plus, many of the sculptures that I showed you, the Roman sculptures, are reproductions, and they used very, very primitive 3D imaging to create them using a system of pins that they drill into the stone certain distances and then carve away. It was almost a mechanized way of making sculpture. So, we think we've invented, a kind of mechanical reproduction, but these Roman sculptures were often mass produced.
Well, and they were copies of earlier Greek sculptures, right?
Correct. Yeah. But they were all, as it were, scanned
right.
with these point systems.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. I also love the idea that all of these sculptures were actually painted in these strangely dark colors. And we have learned through history to understand them as being kind of blank white, sort of blank slates for our ideas of beauty, and thinking about them with these kind of psychedelic colors on them just doesn't go with how we think about them. But what you're doing is actually in dialogue with that idea of the color, I think.
Oh, absolutely. But I'm not trying to reproduce the original colors, but I am like soaking them, dipping them into my own dye bath, as it were.
Yeah.
Is this a MFA class?
Yeah, this is,
okay. Yeah.
These are all MFAs. Any other questions? I mean, I think this has been really great. Fantastic demonstration. And
I can also send you a PDF of both of the processes that I use. I don't recommend the gelatin process, but I can, if any of you are, does anyone work with gum bichromate? No. That's the process essentially, but the laser process I find very easy to use, and it's limited in size. 12 by 18 is as big as you can go, but
it's interesting, Jim, I saw your name, Jim, that it answered a riddle that I've been working for years. I've been making these drawings, these Xeroxes, laser copies, and then putting graphite on them, and not figuring. I didn't know what the process was that made it work for me, but you just answered it. That there's the laser, whatever that the carbon in the laser is letting the oil of the graphite stick to it.
Yeah.
So yeah, it would be great to have that.
Yep.
Yeah. The PDF. Cool. I guess we should say thank you, and this is okay. So thank you, Jim.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me, and it's great to see you all remotely. I've taken screenshots of both of looks like there are 2 screens of you, so I appreciate showing up today. And
may I ask a question?
Yes, absolutely.
Yep. My question is, I'm curious about, do you have an idea first, then do the process, like photograph or anything else, or you just do it, then you start to think about the meaning of it?
For these pictures, I spent about 2 years researching and experimenting with this process before I had the image.
Mhm.
So I was ready when I got the image. So the process came first, and then I found an appropriate image. And I don't know if that's the way all my work proceeds, but I think, you know, just working in process, trying different things, eventually and hopefully you find the right subject matter for it. So I think that's especially if you know, like certain work looks better in black and white, so you take a lot of black and white pictures, but then you find one subject that is very powerful in black and white. So it's similar to that.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay, I'm gonna have lunch
Okay.
now.
Yes.
You.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you
Hi.
so much.
Thanks everyone for coming. It's good to see you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for holding this.